Well, we're going to get started. I expect we might have a few more people trickling in as we begin. So welcome to, this is the 6th of our TNFD data lab sessions that we've been holding throughout the week. Really excited to have you all here today. We're going to, well, first off, I'll introduce myself. I'm Dan O'Brien. I'm a partner with PWC Canada and also a member of the Task Force on Nature-Related Financial Disclosure. Myself and James, who I think actually just had stepped out. Oh, there he is. We are, we're involved in leading a working group within TNFD, which is focused on data and analytics to support companies that are working on developing TNFD-aligned disclosures. One of the things that we have done with this working group is developed or stood up what we call the Data Catalyst Initiative. And the Data Catalyst Initiative is bringing together a group, I think we're at about 110 organizations that are representing data providers, both from smaller nature tech startup organizations to academic institutions, to the large data aggregators and data providers. So we have kind of a very broad representation of different data providers, both at the site monitoring level, all the way up to the aggregation and biodiversity footprinting level. And we've been engaging with these data providers through a series of workshops to really uncover what the challenges and the gaps and the issues are with respect to nature-related data. So as a result of that, we've come up with a pretty good comprehensive understanding of where these issues and challenges are. But what we wanted to do here at COP was bring together data providers with users in different sectors to really start to explore some specific use cases and understand how companies that are trying to address nature-related risk and biodiversity are using different data sources to assess and understand what their impacts are and how they're managing those impacts. And then pair them up with folks who are working with nature-related data, who are providing solutions, who are providing platforms. And really the intent is to illustrate how these two, how the users and the data providers can provide and apply the TNFD. At the heart of this, we understand that when the TNFD framework is finalized in September, we really want to see broad scale market adoption, obviously, of the TNFD. And I think there's sort of a general understanding that in order for that to happen, there has to be available data platforms, data tools that companies can use to do the assessment. And so really we're trying to raise awareness and provide some examples of how users are using different data platforms. And then what we're going to do after we hear from the panelists and have some questions and answers is break you out into groups. And this is actually where the feedback that we've received to date from the others is that this has been really the most meaningful part of these sessions. So this is an opportunity for you as the audience to start to interact with some of our panelists and some of us to start talking about some of the challenges that you're facing, what you're observing, and really try to get to the heart of some of these issues. And we're actually collecting this information from you. So we're going to be recording and taking notes so that we can actually consolidate all this information. And then that is hopefully going to guide sort of some of the efforts going forward. So with that, I think with the microphone, it sounds like we do have the PA working, but sometimes when there's other sessions going on in this building, they have to bring the mic down. And also, I think it's a bit tricky for the folks online sometimes to hear, but it sounds like we've got the mic up right now, which is good. Okay. So first of all, I'm going to introduce all of our panelists. And then we'll hear from each one of them, and they're going to provide us with a bit of a description of either their business and their approach to how they're assessing nature risk, and then also or to tell us a little bit more about their platform and their data tool and how it's used. So first off, online we have Adam Thompson, who's from IBM, Global Sustainable Finance and ESG Reporting Leader. We also have Ed Ellis here from IBAT, which is, well, I'll let you describe your platform, but when we get to that. We have Marti Perenya. I hope I got your name correct. That's from Labelia Earth. And we have Kathleen Buckingham from Verity. So why don't we start off with, let's go with Adam, who's online, and maybe you can tell us a little bit about how IBM, the kind of solutions that you're providing, and maybe some specific examples for us.
Sure. And unfortunately, I don't see the audience anymore. So if you can just give me a quick yes that you can hear me loud and clear, and then I'll commence. Perfect. Thank you. So my name is Adam Thompson. I sit in the consulting part of IBM. IBM is obviously a Centurion organization, like a number of the consulting practices that are here today. But the reason I mention this point is that when we're looking at sustainability and when we're looking about data reporting and ESG specifically, IBM, what's not known quite so widely or publicly, we've been doing a lot of this reporting ourselves internally for over 30 years, and in terms of data collection for 50 plus. If we come to around data specifically for sustainability, and one of the acquisitions we did around 2016, just to contextualize and frame this up front, was around the weather company. So a lot of you have the mobile app around weather, and as well as using it for enterprise data analytics. That's actually IBM seeing a background. Since the acquisition, as you could imagine, with a number of the regulations, so today we're here to talk about TNFD, but just to contextualize once more, for TCFD, we actually built a number of different tools and capabilities in the analytics spectrum, but also about how to create those data catalysts. And I'll elaborate on those a little bit more in a moment. But to fast forward them, we actually are leveraging similar sort of capabilities from a tooling perspective, but predominantly using this then for the broader nature-related use cases. So if we're talking about forestry, just to give you one example then, we actually use geospatial data, we use remote sensing data, and we actually look at how we can tag nature-based, so whether that's trees, any other plants in this regards, and working out both in terms of above and below the biomass, what is not just for carbon sequestration, but also looking at some of the ecosystem services about what's that mean for social impact if we talk about urban forestry. And one of the recent examples we published was around Manhattan, and how obviously that can impact the 1.6 million population with additional planting of trees, obviously. But then if we look at it more broadly, today's session is around forestry and construction, but we, of course, we look at the whole spectrum. So if we talk about marine life and looking about below the ocean, some of the recent work with the autonomous shipping with Mayflower, and how we're now actually using that in industrious capacity for shipping, transport logistics, and then vice versa. If we're looking about the actual segmentation of that in terms of the social impacts, more for those who are currently facing the biggest impacts due to climate and nature biodiversity loss, we have also a sustainability accelerator program where we work with a number of different NGOs applying for free technology and helping them looking at new agroforestry techniques or looking at energy transition techniques and so on. I'm going to probably pause there to allow the other panelists to introduce themselves, but as you can imagine, we have a huge tech stack behind us, so feel free during the panel and the Q&A to ask me any other questions around ESG, and I'm more than happy to share our insights. So thanks, Dan.
After we do the introductions, then we'll have a chance to do some questions and a bit more of a discussion. So Kathleen, why don't you tell us a little bit more about Verity and perhaps a quick example of how Verity can be used by the forest sector?
Yeah, thank you. Well, I'm Director of Impact actually for two sister companies. So 10 Tree is an apparel company that plants trees for every item of clothing sold. And so with my private sector hat on, that is embedded within disclosure mechanisms, what I've been working on is, CDP, science-based targets, life cycle analysis, reporting, a very carbon-focused approach. And I can see that it is changing to more of a nature-based approach. And so with 10 Tree, we're quite forward thinking in that we're nature-based with the tree planting approach. And you might say, okay, like it's a CSR approach, but we're just about to celebrate our 100 millionth tree for 10 Tree over 10 years. So through that, we've had to create our own system of reporting. How do we know we've planted 100 million trees? What impacts or benefits have come out of that? And to be honest, we don't have all the answers. And that's why we created our own system, Verity, to think about Tentree as our first best customer. If you imagine with Amazon, they created AWS for themselves. We're thinking as Tentree as a brand that needs to disclose on impact. How do we create that for ourselves? So that was our starting point. So we thought about, what do we need to know pre-planting? What do we need to know for the planting in terms of survival rates? How do we know these are even surviving? And as you can imagine, over the past 10 years, we're working directly with planting organizations. We're not involved in planting ourselves. So there has been an evolution of how NGOs are working within this space. And it's not a criticism, you know, traditionally, maybe you get a certificate that says, congratulations, you've planted 1 million trees. The same way as if you are sponsoring a polar bear, you get a photo of the polar bear. But now we need to be thinking about what is needed to verify that, what is needed to verify the impact. So that was our starting point as Tentree and Verity. And over the past year or so, we've changed into an organization where it's blockchain enabled, it's traceable, and we're thinking about those different aspects and how we move towards a Verity standard. How do we package that for corporates? And we've had a lot of corporate organizations come to us and say, we want to have a model like Tentree. How do we package impact ultimately and sell that to customers? So that, you know, we're going to go into various details of what we're doing, but you know, we've just come back, for example, from Kenya and Rwanda, where we're doing eDNA acoustic monitoring. We're looking at Verity as more of a restorative operating system, where that means that we're ground-based fundamentally as an application, but we're plugging in different techniques and technologies from different providers to create that whole system. And with the Verity standard, we're looking to engage, measure, verify, and report. And it really aligns with the LEAP approach. And I think what's quite important is how the LEAP approach is saying, how are we different from the task force for climate disclosure, and that element of stakeholder engagement? Because with Verity, we really have to start at the engage process. There's people involved. I'd like to go into more of that when we have that panel discussion, but I think stakeholder engagement is a key differentiator from the climate conversation that we need to make sure that we're engaged in the forest sector. Thanks. Looking forward to chatting more.
Well, thank you so much, Kathleen. It's very interesting to hear how an apparel company has kind of pivoted into like a monitoring and reporting and verification platform. So, Renata, I'd like to hear from you. And you know, this is a session not just on forestry, but also on construction. Can you tell us a bit about how Wholesome is assessing nature-related risk? And some of the challenges that you have come across with respect to nature-related data, and where you've been able to solve those issues.
Yes, thank you. Hi, everyone. Pleasure to be here with you today. I'm Renata Polin, the head of nature at Wholesome. So I don't know if everybody knows what we do, Wholesome. So just a quick overview. We produce cement, aggregates, and concrete, and also nowadays some roofing systems. So a lot of materials that are going to be used on construction. And I think by now you guys could understand that our operations are very closely linked to natural resources. We rely on natural resources. We have quite many years of experience of assessing our impacts and dependencies and reporting these in many reports, CDP, our annual sustainability report, and so on and so forth. And how we assess our data. So starting in our own operations, we do measure our water withdrawal, our freshwater withdrawal, our water consumption, our CO2 emissions. So we do have in our own operations primary data. it's important to know that we have more than 2,300 sites and more or less 900 queries in 60 countries. So it's huge, our footprint in our own operations. So we do have like most of the data is primary data. We really measure it in our own operation. We have quite a good control. If I think about upstreams, the supplier, we we have more than 100,000 tier 1 suppliers, and most of them, 80% of them are SME suppliers. And we don't necessarily know where they are located. We don't have their coordinates, different if we compare to our own operations. So what we do with in the upstream is we use a tool called AxioBase. And this tool help us to understand our impacts, because what we know is how much we spend per country in different categories. So for example, packaging or electricity and so on and so forth. So this tool, the output of the tool is like different categories of nature, like water consumption, biodiverse land use, water pollution, air pollution, and so on. So we know like what's our impact per category, per country. So it facilitates us to focus where we should reduce the impact. This tool is AxioBase. Now, the challenge is on the downstream at our customer level. Our operations are very decentralized. You know, cement, aggregates, and concrete. We do not export. This is too heavy. You know, can you imagine how this would be difficult? So it's very, very local. And we do not necessarily track what happened with our end user or who our end users are. So we do have a very big challenge on the downstream, the impact in the downstream, which we find a pity, because this is, I think, where we could have a lot of positive impact, because we are like trying to reconcile nature with the city. So having products that are helping to thrive nature, like we have like a product which the name is Hydromedia, which is a porous concrete that allows, like when there is a rain, it infiltrates into the soil and you can grow trees close to this concrete, because it just form artificial aquifer below the soil. So, and we are trying to implement more of these solutions to bring more nature to the city, but we don't have like data. How do we measure biodiversity or our impacts on that? So I think the downstream is our biggest challenge. But I think, so I always think, you know, the dream would be like in the food industry, if you could have a traceability, you know. Can you imagine, we are here, a lot of concrete, where this is from, you know, how many trees we saved or how many CO2 we emit. That will be for me the dream, but we are not there yet.
Well, it's interesting that we have both forestry and construction, because I think on the forestry side, this is an issue that forestry companies have been having to deal with for a long time, and traceability and chain of custody is something that's quite mature in the forest industry, and they're able to pass down claims about their products to their customers. And maybe that's some, you know, these kinds of traceability systems could be adopted in other sectors. But that's really useful, and it's helpful also to understand how location specific your business activities are and the challenges that you have around your tier 1 suppliers in terms of locating their activities, and then the reliance that you have on tools like AxioBase, which give you sort of the average for the particular area. But Ed, maybe this is a good segue into your organization and IBAT, and you can kind of explain how you work with companies like Wholesome or other forestry companies to look at. Well, I'll let you explain, but.
Brilliant, thanks. So hi everyone, my name is Ed. I'm the manager for the Integrated Biodiversity Assessment Tool, or IBAT. And IBAT is a web-based mapping and reporting application that's really designed to provide integrated access to critical biodiversity information. So behind me, behind the IBAT tool, sits the IBAT Alliance. It's a group of 4 leading conservation organizations: IUCN, BirdLife International, Conservation International, and UNEP WCMC. And these are organizations that have spent decades producing and curating some of the most globally authoritative biodiversity data sets around: the IUCN Red List of Threatened Species, the World Database of Key Biodiversity Areas, and the World Database on Protected Areas. IBAT draws those data sets together and makes it easy for the private sector in particular to access that information. And we've been doing this for a long time. IBAT's been around for about over 16 years now. And it's really enabled companies across a variety of sectors to understand their potential biodiversity related risk, specifically at that location asset level screening. So we've just heard from Wholesome, who I'm really proud to say are an IBAT subscriber and have been using IBAT data for quite some time now. But even just at that direct footprint level, you've got hundreds of quarries over dozens of different countries. And where IBAT can help play a role is starting to help identify which are the priority areas that you need to really take a closer look at. So thinking about TNFD and the LEAP framework, really on that locate your interface with nature aspect. Once you know where your quarries are in the world, you can start to understand what's the proximate biodiversity around them and what are the potential risks that that poses to my business. Where are nearby protected areas? What are the threatened species that might be impacted by my operations in a site? Once you have this information, that's where you can really start to prioritize and narrow down, okay, from across our portfolio, where are the sites where we have the largest potential impact, where we might want to think about mitigation actions? Where do we have opportunities that we can take on the restoration aspect? How can we start to restore degraded landscapes, rehabilitate quarries or mine sites, reforest degraded areas? And where are we able to do that so we can have the most benefit for species or for landscape connectivity? And so while the most direct sort of plugin for IBAT in the LEAP framework is really on that locating your interface, there's a lot of organizations who are starting to move beyond that to evaluating and assess, not so much preparing yet, but it's certainly the potential is there, particularly with a metric that we released recently called STAR, which is the Species Threat Abatement and Restoration metric. And this is really about taking that really rich compendium of species information that's contained within the IUCN Red List of species, drawing out the information on threats and pressures that species face, and then turning it into a quantifiable metric that can be used to specifically quantify the opportunity you have to reduce species extinction risk. I'm not sure where things currently stand in negotiations today, but one of the core goals for the Global Biodiversity Framework was reducing the risk of species extinction by 50% by 2030. And this is where STAR directly ties into those global biodiversity frameworks and provides an opportunity for the private sector to contribute to these global conservation goals that are really so impactful on what we're striving to achieve just over the road.
Great. That's great. Thanks, Ed. So we've heard a bit about sort of the larger scale assessment, applying the locate phase to try to narrow down and identify priority areas where an organization would want to do a more local and site level assessment. So perhaps this is a great opportunity, a good segue for Marty to explain a bit more about what Labelia Earth is doing with your Earth observation platform.
Yeah, okay, so thanks for the introduction, for letting us be here. So basically, at Labelia Earth, well, I'm Martí, and I'm an Earth observation scientist. And at Labelia Earth, as my title would say, we are very much specialized on the Earth observation side of things, but we're also on the climate modeling, and we use computational intelligence and software tools to be able to drive climate action for companies. So provide this data and these tools in a way that they are comprehensive for them to be used. So yeah, basically, we're a team compounded by engineers, by scientists, but also by scientific communicators, by designers. And this is what allows us to, bring that added value on the data, to be able to make this data somehow of a message or something that people can use, not only for disclosure, but also for action. And this is where both the TNFD and ourselves, we've seen like a huge challenge, and it's in this gap between the vast amount of data that there are out there and the maybe littler or like less data that arrives with an added value to the companies to be able to use. There are petabytes of data out there ready to use for the people that know how to use it, but there is this barrier, this know-how that is lacking for many companies. And of course, not every company can afford to have a remote sensing expert, an eDNA expert, a verification expert. So in this sense, initiatives like this one, like the TNFD, like the Data Catalyst, that brings together all these data providers that are able to provide this extra step, is definitely useful. So in order to, tackle this challenge at Labelia, what we do is to create AI models, software tools, etc., as I've mentioned, in order to be able to go from that raw data to a product that is useful for disclosure. I feel like I'm going in a circle now. So then I will go to the other challenge, which is something that I've been hearing in a lot of conversations, and it's about the trust that we put into this data. How do you actually believe that this data is verifiable or traceable or transparent, etc.? And in this sense, what we're trying to do is to pair also, for example, with blockchain, and that is an example of a project that we've just finished. That basically what we've done is to use very high resolution imagery to track individual trees in the Sahel. And this is another thing that is very important, and it's that nothing is easy to do at a global scale, because there's different realities. There is definitely not the same methodology to apply when it comes to a forest in, Brazil, in the Amazon, or when it comes to the Sahel area, where it's completely different. The diversity, the sparse trees between the complete dense forest. So in this sense, we need also to take into account this regional approaches, this location-specific nature of the assets of companies, but also of the science behind it. And in a way, the TNFD is great for that, because if we are able to standardize the outputs that we want to give, we are then able to model in the science side with a goal in mind. Because if you start with no goal in mind, but you just try to develop a metric that is somehow useful for that side, but won't be useful to compare, then it's not the same as if, okay, we want to aim for this metric. Let's find the variables. Let's find the satellite imagery that is useful for that. Let's find the ground truth thing. Let's, add up the different steps that we have, the collection of data, the processing, the analysis after. So in a way, this whole data pipeline that we can build together through the data catalyst, through partnerships, etc. For us, it's a very, very interesting thing, just because, of course, we're not able to be in the whole chain, and I believe it is very difficult to be able to do that by any company alone. But if we partner up, for sure, this is the way to go forward and to create true impact.
Go ahead.
Can I jump in on that? Because I think that echoes a lot of my own thoughts, and I think it is a really powerful message that I'd love for everybody in this room to take away. Is this is a wonderful opportunity for collaboration and taking different approaches to build something that works. There's not going to be any one silver bullet solution. There's not going to be one approach that works across sectors, across industries, across specific use cases, but there's a fabulous wealth of data that's out there. There's a fabulous wealth of tools to help access that data. There's a fabulous wealth of organizations who can help organizations wrap their head around what this all means in practice. And where I see the greatest value for the TNFD and what it's really acting as is a convening force to bring these sorts of approaches together. So the opportunities for collaboration here are incredibly rich, and it's really, really well worth exploring.
Yeah, that's really encouraging to hear you say that, because I think that is the intention, is that through collaboration, some of these really thorny issues and challenges can be addressed. And go ahead, Renata. Yep.
No, just a practical example of collaborations. Like, for example, because I forgot to say, so we, in our own operations, we measure our impact. As I said, we actually measure it. But then, we have a number at the end, and what does it mean? So to prioritize the sites that we need to fix, mitigate risks and so on, we use, for example, IBAT, as he said, to understand where we have sensitive areas, biodiversity sensitive areas. So it's a very easy tool to use and very, very efficient. And then we understand, we say, okay, we need to then focus on these areas to create a biodiversity management plan and so on and so forth. The same thing we do for water. We use a tool, also a global tool. It's open source. The name is Aqueduct tool. It's for the World Resource Institute. And it's also, you just need the coordinates of the sites, and you put the coordinates, and the output is, okay, is this, there's a range of water risk 1 to 5, and give you, if this 1 is low risk, if 5 is high risk, and then you can concentrate, you can prioritize the regions. For example, we whole team prioritize the regions that are 3, 4, 5. For us, we consider all of them high risk. And we prioritize on these specific sites for water, for example.
So that's really interesting, and it kind of leads to an observation and sort of a question I'll put to the panel here. But we've heard examples of how you look across your entire operations, and through the location information are able to use global tools like IBAT and WRI's Aqueduct, and also Xiobase, in cases where you don't have specific location information. But those tools are often, I mean, they're assembled from data sets that are sort of regional or country level, but they don't always represent the specific, some of the specific aspects or issues within the particular regions. There may be additional information. I think, Kathleen, you talked to the disclosure requirement around engaging with stakeholders and bringing in maybe cultural values or traditional knowledge, ecological knowledge. I think, Marie, we were chatting about the fact that in Quebec here, the IBAT tool covers a lot of Quebec, but there's very sort of location specific information that may not be represented in those tools. So Kathleen, could you maybe give us your thoughts on how you can then, with these tools, augment them and integrate very local information to help enhance those enhance that assessment and actually address some of these additional requirements around looking at engaging with your stakeholders?
Yeah, definitely. And I think I'd like to echo how, you have these certain pieces of the LEAP framework, like locate, and it sounds like there's so much information, like you said, at the remote sensing aspect that can speak to that. And I think where Verity really comes into its own, it's the evaluate and assess. And when we're kind of unlocking finance for restoration projects, it has to start with talking to the people on the ground, and it has to start with the pre-planting of what are the land rights, who owns the land, who is engaged with the land. So we really have a process to understand who's engaging with that land. And ultimately, if you're thinking about risks within a landscape, unless there are sustainable livelihoods that are supported within that landscape, there is a risk that it will not be sustainable. So we have socioeconomic surveys that are embedded within our app. It's very, very simple. We're looking at dependencies. We're looking at what access people have to energy. Like what are you cooking with? And when it comes down to we're in mangrove forests and they say fuel wood, what is your income? There is no constant source of income. That needs to be addressed. So if we're talking about biodiversity, we have to be talking about the people, because ultimately, Tentrias has the experience of 10 years ago, they sponsored projects, and you can look now at satellite, what change has happened. Now, the sustainable change has happened where the livelihoods have been taken care of as well in tandem with nature and biodiversity. And I know I'm preaching to the converted here, but in terms of how it shows up in a tool, we have a simple kind of Likert type survey, which is based on emoticons, so it can be used in different languages. And ultimately, you're trying to understand socioeconomic impacts that can be changed by restoration. There are endless questions you can ask, but can it be changed through this restoration journey? The framework that we're based on is my previous job. I worked for the World Resources Institute and the Forestry team, and worked on an indicator framework called the Road to Restoration. And we've simplified that approach, looking at 10 different impacts. So one thing that Verity can do is it can be used as a standalone tool to evaluate and assess in the field based on different packages of technology. So you were speaking about there isn't a one size fits all. And we've found that, you know, when we're thinking about restoring tropical closed canopy forests, it's different from if you're talking about the hills of Rwanda with agroforestry, with individual farmers that are dealing with trees on their landscape, or if you're dealing with mangroves, which are quite isolated from different communities. So the packages, the on the ground kind of data collection techniques, be it, you know, if it's acoustic monitoring or something, we have these different packages that are useful in these different landscapes. And ultimately it goes down to that triangulation of data, that it's not the ground-based alone, but I really think that, you know, this conversation that I'm hearing about eDNA has really opened up the opportunity for the climate conversation has often stayed at the remote level, and you feel like you can make assumptions from that remote level, and understanding that it is that triangulation of data of what do we need to know from the ground to make it work, be it from the socioeconomic or from the DNA or the acoustics and various other things. You know, joining those together, I think, will give the best outcomes ultimately.
That's great. Thank you, Kathleen. I want to ask a question now. So Renata, you were talking about your supply chain, right? And you have good understanding of the spatial location of your own business operations and activities, and a lot of companies do. But where the challenges are often is when you start to look down through your supply chain, and you know, tier 1, tier 2, tier 3 suppliers, you don't always have that information, and so you end up having to rely on models like Xiobase, which give you averages based for particular geographic regions, and then you sort of determine how much of that is attributable to you based on the portion that you're purchasing in that area. Then you use that as a prioritization tool, right? So then that gives you an idea of where there are specific hotspots, and then that presumably guides further assessment. And what I'm curious to know, and maybe from both the construction and aggregate and cement industry, but also from the forestry perspective, how do you get down into that aspect of your supply chain and start to understand whether your suppliers are you know, either contributing to the impacts in that area, or maybe they are employing management strategies that are allowing them to effectively mitigate and manage those risks? So, you know, the issue is if you don't get to that level and start drilling down, then in a way, you're always managing to the mean, right? You're not rewarding the actors that are really going above and beyond and trying to move the needle. And, you know, you may also have the sort of bad actors that are, you know, poor performers, and that presents risk to the business. So maybe you could start by telling us, you know, your approach to doing that sort of deep dive to get at those high risk hotspot areas.
Yes, this is a very difficult but a key question. I mean, we are really starting the journey, in particular on the supplier upstream. What we do today is that we assess the impact through Xiobase, and we disclose the impact. So it's all out there. If you type integrate profit and losses Holcim 2021, you find it's true, it's there, and we access and we disclose our impact. Now, in terms of targets, we are not there yet. We are not there yet. We have a person in the team. She's Eugenia. She's the head of sustainable procurement, and she's now trying to align with the procurement team a way to go down and set targets with the suppliers. We do have a more general target or metric that we want all our high risk suppliers to have environmental management standards in place, like ISO, this type of things. And this we do is by this year we need to reach 100%. We are at 62, 63, if I'm not mistaken. So we reported last year 62, 63. But I think, as I said, you know, we are not there yet. We are starting the journey, and we do have this person in the team who is working directly with the procurement. They are trying to find ways to understand, how to fix this. One thing that happened this year was quite interesting. It was in Argentina. We went to, was a piloting. So she had this idea, okay, let's start somewhere. And then we started in Argentina. So we went to Argentina with the team, very like SME suppliers. So we called some of them, and what we did is we did a presentation of what we would like them to do. And they are doing a lot of the things that we are asking them to do. For example, one of the suppliers was, they had mining, and they were doing rehabilitation plans, like very good, using endemic species. And we went there to visit this because we said, okay, can we go and visit? Yes, we went, we really saw, okay, it's happening. But okay, it was just a pilot. So now we have this challenge, how to scale up this, because it's very difficult. It's 100,000 tier 1 suppliers. These guys, they may buy from others, and it goes more and more and more. So that's one of the challenges that we face at TNFD, because where we stop? Where do we stop? Is also in the downstream, where we stop? We stop when the construction, we have the demolition, or, so that's one of
the scope question has come up a few times. Yeah.
So
I think the point that you're making, and it's a good one, and I've seen this as well, is it's about engaging with your suppliers. And in a lot of cases, those suppliers are very keen and interested to adapt their processes to meet your requirements, and you actually have a lot of leverage with your suppliers to ask them to adopt these different policies. So it's a good example. Adam, we're going to go to you online here. I'm curious to kind of, when we think about the LEAP process, part of the process is actually to get beyond just understanding the impacts and dependencies, but also starting to get to assessing what the risks and opportunities are for an organization. And I think you mentioned a couple of examples where you've looked at, say, I think you mentioned the forest lands around Manhattan, and perhaps we're looking at the sort of value and the natural capital aspects of that. Could you give us maybe your thoughts on how you go beyond just the assessment of impacts and looking at risk and actually getting to the sort of value aspect, either value destruction or value creation?
Yeah, great question. And I think also with the risks, we should say the opportunities as well, in regards of the value creation point. But so from our lens, and just to maybe call it out, when we're talking about some of the material aspects here, so of course, from prior reporting where there might be targets which were science-based for climate, it was very one-dimensional. But here, when we're actually talking in broader nature, there's obviously multiple layers that we need to unpick here from both a risk and opportunity element. So with each one of those, you can also look also in terms of the categorization of the materiality, and looking at whether that's obviously a single, dual, dynamic, societal. And of course, with each one of those, you're going to end up with some weightings. Now, those weightings obviously need to have some sort of chain of data, coming to Marty's point earlier about, well, what's the absolute value of data, and how can you actually look at that across those different assessment lenses? So for us, where we're looking at it is really, how can you not just define the impact that was obviously from the L and the E in this regards, for more specific E, but on the assess side, how do you actually do that simulation, if you will, both from risk exposure, but also looking at that in terms of both natural capital and obviously new value streams that could be generated as a result of changing business practices. One of the points on business practice, which I think hasn't been teased out in discussion yet, a lot of data that all of us, and there's 100+ of us in the Data Catalyst program, which is fantastic, by the way. And just a little plug for TNFD, there is a catalog of all of this listed in terms of where we actually complement the LEAP program, if you've not seen that. But nonetheless, to come to the value add part, when we're actually looking at rating and doing that predictive piece, you can't just look at it as this is purely on the biodiversity, this is purely on the societal. You need to come up with a mechanism, if you like, to parameterize that, and actually parameterize that for what is your exposure. So not just low, low, and high, high in terms of a 3x3 grid, but actually looking at it in terms of what are the short, medium, and long, but also what are the practices that you need to embed besides having that data structure. So where you would, and just to call it out, besides the change management and the engagement model, where you would, let's say from a modeling viewpoint, gain more value is indeed looking at those that are very much location based on those materiality assessments that you got up front. And there are also additional ones which can be leveraged by the UN, the UNEP, Corporate Sustainability Materiality Toolkit, but as well as obviously the alignment that's been going on with the SBTN and the other knowledge-based partners. But where you want to get to is obviously looking at those that are in the high category and then exposing those in terms of like two metric sources. Metric source number one would obviously be, and I'm probably jumping into the prepare category, but I'll call them out anyway, is obviously the exposure metrics and the magnitude metrics. And maybe that's probably a nice plug to allow somebody else to chip in. But basically the plug here is that if you're looking at those two categories in terms of risk, but also opportunity, what then are the missing data elements to quantify that, both qualitatively as well as from a quantitative model? And I think it's really that encapsulation which you need to look at from both a data modeling as well as from, let's say, a strategic governance lens. And that's not straightforward for all of us. We know that, right? None of us are going to have all the answers, but equally, it's how do you create that framework or sub-framework to provide you with, let's say, that prioritization, and you can address those accordingly against the timeline that you also want to report it or align yourselves towards. Sorry for the long-winded answer, Dan, but I'm hoping I'm teasing out a few more points, more on the opportunities on the risk side there for the other panelists.
Starting to delve into a very complex, but not intractable issue, right? I think we can learn a lot from other areas of risk assessment and that are already in place within many organizations and adapt those for what we're talking about here. I'm going to go to the audience now. I'm sure you've got some questions and some thoughts that you might want to elaborate on. Does anybody have any questions? Or I think we also have a few folks online as well who might have some questions. Okay, James.
Thanks very much, and thanks to the panel for a really interesting discussion. So talking about triangulation, Kathleen, that's a really important point, being able to sort of marry the remote sensing with ground truth data. Is there a way of empowering indigenous peoples and local communities with that role with regard to the ground truth data, and to keep them at the front and give them a kind of a guardianship role in this?
That's something we've been working on. And just as an example, in Kenya, we're working very closely with the government at different levels. We're working with the managers of the nurseries, and we've been training them with eDNA, soil sensors. We're working with local people that fly drones. So there's lots of ways locally, and we're speaking to various research organizations, universities within the country to make sure that it's empowering and enabling. You know, ultimately, we're not going to be flying in and out. But what if, like you said, you know, we're more enabling a system and providing jobs and opportunities through, say, spot drone checks and the technology where we've been provided secondhand androids by a company. So we're providing everyone in the field with androids. The reason why it's androids is the technology is built on the realities on the ground. It shouldn't blow up when it gets really hot. It also, you know, needs to have a really long battery life. These kind of things that I haven't been with the company for 10 years, but the people that have been in the field, you know, well up to our knees in mud, recognize what needs to happen on the ground. So our approach is really trying to enable that. We haven't got all the answers yet. And, you know, if others have been doing a similar thing, we'd love to hear from them. But, you know, working directly with planting partners to see how we can support and how we can co-create, because we're not ultimately coming in and saying this is exactly what we want to see. It's what change, you know, that's why we start with the engage, seeking to understand ultimately first. And then we have a framework, but building upon that. And you know, it would be great the more that we can embed it within the systems of disclosure like LEAP, and then the the science-based targets for nature. There's so many acronyms, right? Get tongue-tied. But that's ultimately our aim. And then working with companies that have got all the locations sorted, you know, all those data layers and the remote sensing sorted, but we're embedded within the local level.
Yeah, if I may add to that, we've seen the same, and I couldn't agree more that when you work with these local communities, they really want to be involved. It's not that you give them the opportunity, it's that they're asking for it. They want to be a part of the movement, they want to be a part of the solution. And in a way, we definitely must not let them, but we must encourage them to be a part of it. And in this sense, on this project that I mentioned before in the Sahel, what we have done is to co-create and like co-develop this protocol that they feel comfortable with when taking the measurements, and that it's something that they see that it's feasible with the possibilities, with the difficulty of access, with, you know, there is many things to take into account in countries where there is more complexity to do this. Of course, we might imagine Europe or the US, where it's super easy to go anywhere pretty much and, you know, plant a sensor there and just wait for the results to come back. But the reality is very different, and you definitely have to take that into account. And the fact that they see the project through its inception to the end, seeing the results that come out of what they have done, this is something that they appreciate a lot, and that it makes them believe in it, and it creates an incentive further from the money that they might get by capitalizing on it. The fact that they see the motivation and they see the power that there is in the solution that they are creating, this is something that is definitely needed for these solutions to actually work.
Thank you very much. I'm going to pitch a kind of a hardball to the audience here, and to the panelists to see if there's any perspectives on this. But I think what we've been talking about is in some ways kind of static assessments, point in time assessments of current state or ongoing monitoring. But one of the things, and the TNFD really speaks to this as well, is that nature is dynamic, and there's also a large interplay with climate and changing climate as well. And as climate is changing and other factors are coming into play, how can we, like, what kinds of data can we take into consideration and can we use to look out into the short, medium, and long term and try to understand how these different factors, these different environmental variables, are likely going to impact the natural assets that forestry and construction companies are reliant on, but also potentially impact the dependencies they have on the services as well. Anybody in the audience have a point of view on that? It's a tricky one.
It's a very hard ball on a Wednesday afternoon. We
have a brave soul over here.
Hi. So I'm Charlotte from Forest Maplecroft. It's a hard one, and having done some work in places like the Sundarbans in India, you can see that there is obviously degradation, and some of that isn't being helped by practices on the socioeconomic side, such as aquaculture. But then you look at the impact of climate change and the salt intrusion into the mangrove forest, and that is causing degradation and stunting growth. And then you've got sea level rise, where that's going to take large areas of that mangrove forest. And actually, if you want the mangrove to be able to remain in terms of its area, then that's displacement of people, and the very vulnerable people. So I think it's really complex in terms of like the interlinkages. But there are, obviously, we can use the data on the climate side to inform that potential degradation into the future.
And I think what you've pointed to is an interesting concept that is relevant for forestry in particular, which is this idea that forestry is not, and we've talked a bit about IPLCs as well. Forestry doesn't operate in isolation of other activities that are happening on the land base, both natural processes, but also other industrial activities as well. And so, you know, there's this concept of cumulative impacts or cumulative effects, and taking into consideration, you know, your own operations within the context of other organizations that are operating in that area. And I think it also ties into what you were describing, is this complex interactions where, you know, it's not just a single linear cause and effect relationship with some of these nature-related risks. There are complexities that depend on multiple different factors. But does anybody have any examples of, you know, looking at cumulative effects, the types of data sources, platforms that you might be familiar with?
So
right here. Okay, excellent.
Sorry.
Thank you. I'm Ana Lima, and I'm currently working for the WBCSD Brazil. I don't have examples of data sources, but I think what we're trying to do in terms of implementing the TNFD is a bit different. So the company, so WBCSD is led by the 100 largest companies in Brazil, so 50% of the GDP. And what they decided to do is, instead of doing only the individual journey, they're doing a collective journey where the companies of like the 4 key components of each sector: land use, built environment, energy, and food, try to align behind what data they're going to use, how they're going to call the activities and processes and dependencies and impacts. And what happened is, as a result, you have sectoral priority territories. So they know when they overlap the dependencies and impacts geographies, who is in the territory, and what exactly, how much they depend. So you can interrelate a landscape transition strategy based on targets and based on what these companies understand as important environmental assets and ecosystem service. So I thought it was a very interesting example of collaborative and collective approach to transition a territory.
That's a really good example. And I've heard others where, when looking at sort of the cumulative effects or cumulative impacts, you have to engage with other operators, other partners, and really create a platform for sharing of data, whether it's, you know, site level monitoring data, or whether it's remotely sensed data or data products from remote sensing that is accessible to all of the players in there. And that's probably one of the bigger challenges is, you know, there's a lot of money that's spent on collecting site level data and a real reluctance to share that because of the investment, right? But I guess there's this understanding that by sharing it, you're actually enabling yourself as an organization to better understand your context, because the other players in the area are able to utilize it. I think we had I'm sorry, we have somebody on. Oh, Adam, did you want to add a point to that?
Yeah, just a couple of quick
Renata
examples. Sorry. Just a couple of quick examples, and then just to on the data side of things. So I mentioned in my introduction that obviously worked with various NGOs, etc., and one of them was around with Haifa International on the climate piece on agroforestry, specific in the LATAMs, where we can actually leverage obviously historical data sets, looking at modeling versus IPCC, etc., but more on in the engagement part of how we're actually understanding not just from farming practice, but also what does that mean in terms of the land usage, and then how do we actually look at the soil degradation, and etc. And that's something we're getting from both, not just sensory, but from geospatial. The other very quick one, and then I'll pass the floor to Renata. When we're actually looking at well, one of the projects that we're running currently around the sub-Sahara region is actually looking at restoration of obviously native species of trees, but looking at the implication of that for water purification for local communities, and obviously for those enterprises that obviously have a a footprint in that space. And I think when we talk about the data set, what's interesting post the baselining, obviously, of the land usage itself, and this is really like the layer cake, basically, that you have to get to do the modeling in the first place, from literally from source to surface. What we actually started to find, and of course this was not an overnight affair, it was just many months now of data curation. But what you actually get, though, is really a very good data stream in understanding of what is the, of course, for the water quality, and obviously about the tree growth, etc., but also about the societal, so to the network effects, if you will, as the multiplier factor, as to what that actually means about bringing those communities back to those areas. And I think that's, I'd like to see more of that personally, but I think that's the sort of the data sets that need to be even more exposed for that consumption in a more mainstream I suppose, ingesting for corporations. And I think that's one of the takeaways, that we've still yet got to do some work, not about integrating all the data sources, but exposing it in that consumable manner. Because I think, I forget which panelist mentioned it, but not every organization is going to have a data modeler to be able to do that level of analysis. And I think that's the other thing just to reflect on as we're on this journey through to next year, then the consultation phase, how we make that more productionized for all parties, to exactly your curveball for a Wednesday afternoon or an early Tokyo Thursday morning then.
Is it working? Yes, now. Is one insight on the accumulative effect and also the share. So I think the science-based target for nature framework can support us and can help us on that, because under step 3, which is set targets, so they have some step, but step 3 is the name is set targets. One of their criteria is that we need to involve the local community. So for the water, it's all the players that are withdrawing in the same watershed that we are withdrawing, to understand what is the maximum withdrawal per player, per industry or per communities, and then with this value on hand, you can then set your targets. And this is a criteria under the science-based target for nature, which is already out there for public consultation. So I believe if this goes forward, I think it probably could help companies to solve this challenge, or at least to minimize the.
No, it's a really good example, I think. We had a question right here.
Thank you. Hello, I'm Benoit from EPE France. We are a convener of a French TNFD consultation group. So we've been hearing a lot about the TNFD, and especially about the LIP process. And I was interested in knowing to what extent the data presented here today could help in selecting the assets to which you apply the LIP process as a company. So is there a selection you make, and is the data provided by the data providers help to make that selection, to really locate the assets you want to prioritize for the TNFD reporting? Thank you.
Yeah, okay. Probably from a tool like IBAT, and maybe Ed will elaborate on that later, you already have a feeling of what to prioritize. But so far, what we've done for, like, as many of you and we have already said, that the climate is sort of like some years ahead of us, right? And we have seen in the climate area in our products that what is useful for people is to have these levels of risk that you can see, and that you can even set, depending on your organization, you can set thresholds for which is the level that is acceptable for you. And then if you have all the assets located, and then you have all of this data in location specific and aggregated, all together in a platform, that makes it easy for you to set, okay, this is not desirable, what is under this threshold, what is over this threshold. If something similar is done with nature, taking into account that nature, again, is something more complex, it has more metrics, it has, different methodologies that are not so straightforward as a climate model. But if we are able to, as I was saying before, to set those standards against which we can compare, and you are able to set those thresholds using models that are validated, that are, rigorous scientifically, etc., then just by seeing it as sort of easily as possible on a platform which ones are in red and are like, hey, alert, you know, like here you have to prioritize these ones, and other ones are like in yellow or in green, or like you're doing good, or you know, like this is something that is definitely possible with the technology that is out there. But as Adam was saying, we need to fill this gap of creating these user-friendly platforms, creating this understandable data for customers to be able to have then on their side this priority assessment. Even if it's like 3 or 4 that are red and you still have to choose between them, you can still dig deeper into the data, but you need this first step of very visually, this is wrong, this is right. And yeah.
Yeah, I'm happy to jump in on this one as well. The short answer is, I think, yes, there are options out there. IBAT is one of them. We've been helping the finance community in particular to perform that high-level prioritization workflow against the International Finance Corporation's Performance Standard 6, which is really industry best practice on looking at asset level financing and making that sort of high level priority assessment. And so there's a concept embedded within that standard relating to critical habitat. So a number of different sort of trigger mechanisms for that. Is your asset in close proximity to a UNESCO World Heritage Site? Is it in close proximity to an Alliance for Zero Extinction site, one of the last remaining refuges in the world for an endangered or a critically endangered species? Does your site overlap with more than 10% of a range restricted species? So there are standards out there that have already start to lay out, in this case, what is critical habitat, and then that triggers enhanced due diligence for the finance sector. Within IBAT, what we do is we have a bespoke risk screening report that says you can quickly look and screen an asset and say, is this likely to trigger that critical habitat definition? And you can apply similar sorts of approaches with TNFD reporting standards. I think the tension always comes around that threshold standard. Is this something that an organization should be setting internally and deciding, this is our risk threshold, this is our risk tolerance, this is where we would like to set priorities in terms of, or where we're comfortable operating, versus is this something that we should be embedding into tools and platforms so that you can easily identify, this is high risk, this is medium risk, this is low risk, because that's always going to be slightly contextual. And one of the things that we've been talking about on this panel is sort of the difference between global and local data, right? The advantage of global data sets is that it does allow you to perform that comparative analysis. You can look across the entirety of your portfolio, the entirety of your assets, your operations, and start to undertake that prioritization assessment and figure out, these are the highest risk. And let's be realistic. How many operational sites? Hundreds.
2,300 sites and 900 queries. So
massive amounts of operation. You're not going to be able to collect data at all of those sites. You're not going to be able to take action at all of those sites. We do need to be realistic that there's going to be certain places where you prioritize your level of effort. And this, I think, is a really important role for this sort of global contextual data to play, is helping you make that decision on where to invest my time, where do I invest my resources, where am I going to get the most bang for my buck for nature for investing that. And that's where the move towards more local data, whether it's eDNA, acoustic monitoring, remote sensing, but also the opportunities to engage with indigenous people on the ground. And so there's a really important role for global data, but it has limitations, and this is where local data can supplement it. But that prioritization analysis is really, really key.
And I think you summed it up perfectly there. I think that's a very good kind of way of thinking about how LEAP and TNFD can be applied. And so we're going to shift into the next phase of the workshop here, which